Welcome to another episode, everyone. The war between the Hoovers and the South Los 13s was a very deadly and violent war. The South Los 13s are a Southern Mexican gang located in South Central Los Angeles. They claim two territories off of the 110 freeway. They have the east of the 110 freeway and the west of the 110 freeway. The east of the 110 freeway, they had a territory close to the 11 Deuce Broadway Gangster Crips. And on the west of the 110 freeway, they were extremely close to the 11 Deuce Hoovers and the Denver Lane Bloods. Everything was going well with the South Los and the Hoovers at first. The South Los were formed in the mid-70s as well as the 11 Deuce Hoovers. The South Los and the Denver Lane Bloods were particularly pretty close at this time. In the mid-1980s, when the epidemic hit, when the illegal substances began to come over, sanctioned by the CIA, and everyone began to sell this stuff and make money, the South Los and the Hoovers were involved in the same game. They were both making money off of this illegal substance. The Hoovers, the 11 Deuce Hoovers, claimed a territory on 110th in Vermont, a street that they call the one way because it was one way in and one way out. The Hoovers hung out on this street 50, 60 deep every day. The South Los were at the end of the one way, and this is where they were hanging out and making their money. The South Los one day told the 11 Deuce Hoovers that they were sick and tired of them infringing upon their territory with the illegal substance, shorting their customers, taking their clientele, short-stopping their money, and that it needed to stop. A little argument went back and forth, nothing much, because the 11 Deuce Hoovers and the South Los at the time, they got along just fine. They went to school together. Some South Los went to Locke High School. Some of them went to Washington High School. And they were so close in proximity, the two gangs, that they all knew one another. Then one night, or actually in the morning at about 2 in the morning, and O.G. Hoover was there in the one way. And he was selling his illegal substance. He was approached by 5 or 6 South Los who had told him that they were sick of him selling this stuff in their neighborhood. The O.G. Hoover was not alone. There was about 2 other Hoovers with him, but since it was about 2 a.m. in the morning, they were not out there with many people. An argument ensued, and then a fight, a melee. And the South Los used a weapon, a pipe of some sort, and hit the O.G. Hoover in the head with the pipe. The Hoover went down, and the South Los dispersed. The O.G. Hoover went to the hospital. Since it was 2 a.m., no one really knew what had transpired, but about 8 a.m. that same morning, 9 a.m., 10 a.m., as the Hoovers began to come to their territory, to the one way, word is rapidly spreading about the incident that had just transpired with the OG homie just a few hours prior. Everyone is up in arms now and very upset. The OG homie had been released from the hospital. But this does not mitigate the anger that the Hoovers feel. The decision had been made. Retaliation was in order immediately. A shootout ensued that night. And then a dude named Lil Bugsy from South Los, who was in a wheelchair, came down the one way one day, antagonizing the Hoovers. Since he was in a wheelchair, they sort of let him get away with that and go on about his business, but told him, don't come back. But Bugsy, he didn't listen. And he indeed came back down to the one way just a few days later, but this time the Hoovers had it well. They were already engrossed in a violent war with the Denver Lane Bloods, the Raymond Avenue Crips, the Rolling 100s. The 11 Deuce Hoovers were surrounded by enemy territory. There were constant shootouts daily and nightly there in the one way. And you never really knew where it was coming from because, again, they were beset by the opposition. Having been engrossed in all of these different wars, they were fed up. And when he came down the one way, Lil Bugsy, once again, antagonizing the Hoovers, well, this time they opened fire and shot Lil Bugsy to death. He lay dead there in the street in broad daylight. This really kicked off the war. And in 1989, Lil Man from South Los robbed 3 Hoovers. Word is that the Hoovers were shooting dice with Lil Man from South Los, and then he pulled out a weapon because he was upset that he had lost his money in the dice game. That is not what happened. Lil Man robbed 3 Hoovers and shot 2 of them in the head and brutally murdered 2 of them right there on the spot. When the word got out, well, Lil Man, he had a target on his back. The Hoovers wanted the head of Lil Man from South Los. And in 1990, less than a year after his 2 brutal unalivings, he was caught up to, chased down in the street and gunned down and unalived was Lil Man. And this really ignited and kicked off the war. Well, the South Los were extremely upset with Lil Man going down. He was one of their heavy hitters, clearly, because he had just unalived 2 Hoovers the year before. And they had a lot of love for Lil Man and was upset about the way that he was gunned down. And they kicked up the pressure on the 11 Deuce Hoovers. They began to come through shooting every day and every night. The Hoovers were returning fire and doing their best to hold up, bearing in mind that they were surrounded now by warfare. 4 to 5 different territories coming through daily and nightly shooting at the 11 Deuce Hoovers. So the South Los, well, they were a bit conniving and understood that the Hoovers were at a weakened state. Some of the Hoover generals were incarcerated at the time. not a lot of leadership, not a lot of bodies. A lot of people were already dying, being shot up in these different wars and going to prison for putting in work for these wars. So the Hoovers, the 11 Deuce Hoovers, were weakened. The Southlows understood that, and they were opportunists. And they began to apply pressure daily upon the 11 Deuce Hoovers, and truthfully began to push the 11 Deuce Hoovers back towards the 107s. Yes, indeed. The truth is, the Southlows had essentially taken over the 11 Deuce territory. The Hoovers were fighting back the best that they could, but they were being pushed back with not a lot of numbers left. After a few months of being over there with the 107 Hoovers, a few OG Hoovers from 11 Deuce came home from prison. They had already heard about the war and everything that had transpired. But now they're seeing for themselves what's going on with their neighborhood, and that the 11 Deuce Hoovers are over here kicking it with the 107 Hoovers. And they said, no, this can't happen like this. We're going to take our territory back, and we're going to take it back now. And the 107 Hoovers and the 11 Deuce Hoovers hooked up really with the 18 streets, because the Southlows have beef with Gardena 13s. Since the 1970s, they've had a decades-long deadly war going on, the Southlows and the Gardena 13s, also known as the Gardena 13s, and they also beef with the 18 streets. So the Hoovers hooked up with the 18 streets because the Southlows had hooked up with the Denver Lane Bloods, applying pressure. They were acting as one. And the 18 streets and the Hoovers began to apply pressure upon the Southlows, return immediate fire, and knock some of them down. In fact, in 2013, there was a brutal shooting that transpired in Southlows neighborhood, where one of them was left in critical condition. Also in 2013, Sergio, it is alleged by the authorities from Southlows, along with Brianna, got into a car, drove into Hoover territory, and brutally unalived a man named Trevor. Authorities found out the license plate of the car and traced it back to a woman named Naomi. She said that she had loaned the car to Sergio. Sergio was later arrested, and the person that was with Sergio in the car, Brianna, testified against him in court. He was indeed convicted of murder. And the war with the Southlows and the Hoovers continued on with shootout after bloody shootout. The Hoovers had made a decision. It was time to end this war. The decision was made at an opportune time. The Hoovers were calculating. They decided to end the war at a time when the Southlows had been weakened. The ongoing war that the Southlows had with the Gardena 13s had taken its toll. On August 10, 2008, an event was held on Imperial and Western, in which 3 Southlows members attended the event. 2 of them were brothers, Victor and Jose. Not long into the event, the Southlows members were spotted by someone allegedly from Gardena 13. The Gardena 13 member opened fire, striking Jose and his brother Victor and the other Southlows member, and another innocent bystander was also struck. Victor and Jose, the 2 brothers, they died they lost their lives. The third South Los member was in critical condition, but he ended up surviving. So the South Los, because of the war with the Gardena 13s, they were not the same gang. Their gang had taken a major hit. But this did not deter the Hoovers. In fact, it animated them. They decided that it was time for retribution. Well, the South Los had took advantage of the fact that the Hoovers had many wars going on just a decade or so before, and had really moved the Hoovers and pushed them back, admittedly, out of their own neighborhood. The Hoovers had never forgotten. They wanted to push the South Los out of their own neighborhood. They didn't want the South Los neighborhood. They just wanted retribution. And with ample resolve and revenge on their minds, the Hoovers began to open fire on the South Los from 2006 to 2017 with unbridled revenge and unfettered bloodshed on their mind. And they began to push the South Los back from 117th in Vermont down further and further, really until the South Los dissipated. Some say that they are no more, that they don't even exist. I don't know if that's true or not, but their numbers are not the same and the gang is not the same. The Hoovers are not totally responsible for this, as again they had wars with the 18th Streets and the Gardena 13s, did the South Los. But the Hoovers are largely responsible for the outcome of the South Los gang. Fed up, angry, and upset with what had transpired years before, the Hoovers steeled themselves. They were war-minded with already active wars going on around them. And they turned up the pressure and turned up the heat and essentially ended the war with the South Los 13s. Stay safe and stay free, people.